last week took on a lot of viral qualities. I got a lot of visits.
Really?
Oh, yeah. So
what did we do right?
Whatever it is, we got to keep doing it.
Keep on doing it.
All right. Let's see. And we are live. Here I am, Charles Moscowitz, live on YouTube and subscribing platforms. Michael D. Shaw is here. He is a chemist. He is a columnist, writes on health, has over 1,000 columns to his credit.
Make sure you pronounce columnist properly, please.
Oh, really? Why? What did I say?
Well, no, I mean, but it's very close to another word that ends in mist. So,
okay. Now, Mike, as you know, and as anyone who's been watching us knows, I am absolutely obsessed with the election, as are most people right now. More people are. And I have to tell you, just before coming on today, I had the chance, I don't know if you saw this, to watch I watched a live stream of the testimony before the Georgia Senate Committee on election fraud.
I think that's still going on.
It is.
Yeah.
And it is sensational. It is just unbelievable. Story after story. These are not ideologues. These are, middle-aged women who happen to volunteer to work the polls, who are coming forward and telling and it's the same thing happened in Pennsylvania, but this is even more stark. They're coming forward and they're telling unbelievable stories, witnessing the most obvious and blatant voter fraud you can imagine. And a lot of it was done by these young women who were manning the polls, who nobody knew. They were not in the community. They were probably, I would suspect, paid by this huge amount of money that poured out of Facebook. Zuckerberg apparently spent $400 million on money to influence elections in various states, particularly the battleground states.
And as I understand it, it came with very specific guidelines that you could only take the money if you did exactly what he said and put in exactly, for example, so many drop boxes.
And also the poll workers. These are people that nobody recognized who are coming in there and suddenly, making these outrageous demands. They showed the footage of that steal in Fulton County, and they showed footage that I had not seen yet. I mean, this is new, where they showed. I mean, it was so outrageous. I mean, they showed these women who their faces weren't before the camera, literally stuffing and restuffing the same ballot through the box.
Rescanning 5 or 6 times at least.
Yeah, and there was a guy who stepped forward who was not from Georgia. He's a computer expert, a data expert, and he made a tremendous case. And he showed that the same thing happened in Pennsylvania, but in Georgia it was worse. And he actually came out and said that that he believes that Stacey Abrams should be arrested.
Wow.
And that he mentioned a few other names that these people had engaged in absolute illegal activity. And he showed it, and you could hear people gasping. It was like, wow. And, I'd be watching it right now, but we're doing the show together. But I think that, I mean, to my way of thinking, I mean, after this, and Giuliani gave a tremendous opening comment, that if they don't decertify that phony slate of Biden people, then we don't have a country. I mean, this is, the fact that this could go on like this in this country is so shocking, and it's so blatant. And
do we have any idea how widely watched this Georgia stuff is right now?
Oh, it's being suppressed. I mean, the only reason I watched it was because it was on OAN.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's, of course, banned. So we're dealing with a blackout in the media. So, yeah, it's probably not being watched. But I think that it probably is being seen enough in Georgia itself that it could cause like a firestorm in that state.
And sort of a backlash that might affect January 5th?
Yes. Well, first of all, if Georgia decertifies the phony Biden slate, it's not that they're going to give ballots to Trump. They're simply going to be in a situation where the state will not have a delegation on January 5th.
Correct.
And so that just simply what that does is it takes those votes away from Biden. And I would predict that if that happens, and that will be huge, then Arizona is going to be next, because right now in Arizona, they've got there's almost a firestorm. I mean, people are in a state of outrage over the Dominion machines and some of the other chicanery that's gone on. They're very similar. It's all very similar in all these states. You know, with finding bags of crumpled Trump ballots in garbage bags behind a church on election day. You know, the same kind of stuff that you have as Secretary of the Assembly there, a Republican, who has issued subpoenas demanding that the Dominion people come before a committee, and they're refusing to come in.
Well, they're just trying to run out the clock.
Well, the point is that they can be arrested for that. I mean, if somebody issued you a subpoena and you didn't show up, you could have, you know, the sheriff come to the door and take you in handcuffs.
Right.
I'm not saying that I wanted to see anybody arrested, but this is contempt of Congress. I mean, this is of legislature. I mean, I don't know if they call it contempt.
Well, there was also, I believe it came on a tweet from Trump himself, showing some data that there were actually more votes counted in Pennsylvania than there were voters.
There's two things coming. Yes, in Pennsylvania, they now have determined that there was significantly more votes counted than voters.
Like 200,000 or something?
Yeah. And also they just found in one of the counties that's very questionable, 27,000 absentee ballots that were not counted. And these were real ballots. I mean, these are people who actually, you know, had signatures. I mean, this is not, you know, and all of a sudden here we are a month and a half after the election, and suddenly they've been discovered. I mean, this is really, really rotten. But I think that if everything goes as we hope in Georgia, and the governor of Georgia, who's really kind of a rotten, you know, he seems like he's not been a good player up until this point. But if he declares the delegation open because of the evidence that's being presented today, and then Arizona follows suit within a day or two, I think, and also declares their delegation uncommitted, then it won't be too difficult for Vice President Pence a week from today to not count those ballots, because they won't have any. And what it means is that I think the numbers would indicate that both Trump and Biden are going to be under the threshold of 270 delegates, which means that the election will be open. And, you know, I suppose that it will have to go to the House.
Well, here's a hypothetical. If even one state decertifies, that story has to be covered by the media.
Oh, yeah.
You can't.
Although in this atmosphere, I wouldn't be surprised if they don't cover it. I mean, you know, if you do a Google search of any of these things and you look at the media, it's more than just deceptive. It's just outright lies.
Well, I mean what I'm saying here is that is an operational fact.
So on a lot of things, I mean, I would be surprised if they don't. If Donald Trump is inaugurated, they don't even cover it.
Yeah,
I mean, it's that bad. I mean, they are not. You know, there is a complete blackout. It's almost like the Soviet Union. I mean, this is the closest thing we've seen to, like, you know, what might have been going on in the early days of Adolf Hitler. Well, I mean, I don't need to sound too hyperbolic.
I have a theory about this, because this type of thing had been raised on other forums. The idea that, you know, why is there so much suppression, and isn't it's okay. I think that, as you agree, the mainstream has been leftist probably since Woodrow Wilson.
Yes.
But what I believe happened is in the 1960s, emboldened by these massive protests, there developed this mentality that not only are we right, meaning the left, and people compare it to religion. I think it's more of a religion. It's actually a fundamental fact of the universe that our position is right. All right. Now, normally, you weren't able to engage these people too much. They didn't like to talk. But occasionally when you did, and I know you've done this, you'll talk to some leftist, and if he stays in the conversation long enough, he will lose. They always lose.
Yeah.
Okay. Then they'll either go catatonic or violent.
Oh, I've seen this happen. You're right. I mean, this is a great observation. Either one of two things happens when I've had leftists on the show, and I've had pretty significant.
You've had some fire breathing.
Yeah, I mean, I've had Noam Chomsky. I did a series with Howard Zinn, Gloria Steinem. I mean, I had some of the big ones, and I've also had just a long list of college professors and political scientists and authors. And they usually do one of two things. Either they go bombastic and they start throwing bombs and they start, throwing, screaming, and sometimes they hang up on me.
Right.
Or they'll become conservatives. They'll just lie. I mean, they'll go to the right of me. I mean, they'll say anything just to win and to keep the argument while they try to slip in their code language.
Okay, but here to interrupt, but here's the point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Most of the time, because of that, they don't engage. So
well, at this point, they don't. I mean, they used to.
Yeah.
But it's gotten so polarized now that they have an alternative universe. And that, of course, if you take a look at the very nature of leftism, and I had David Horowitz on the show Monday, we talked about this.
Yeah.
And he's a former communist, and he knows all about it. And basically that because they do believe that they are so right, even though they're not, they have no firm articulation of what that even means in their own minds. It's all very shifting. But because it's all about power and it's all about being right and transforming the world into their image, whatever they think that may be, they do feel justified in lying, and they feel justified in doing whatever's needed to be done in order to win. They don't want to debate you. They want to destroy you. They believe it's moral. I mean, the people that are doing this voter fraud, these young people, even though they certainly probably have been paid handsomely and all that, they believe in this, and to the point where they are loyal and they are not going to reveal anything. And you get the people in the media, they're true believers, they're unwitting true believers who have been so immersed and besotted by this hatred for Trump.
But
they are conscious, witting participants in a conspiracy, and that they know this and they believe in it.
But if you encountered somebody, pick a field, healthcare, whatever, and you admired what they were doing, you would say, you're doing God's work, all right? And maybe they think they are, except what is the equivalent of that in this atheistic left-wing universe? What is the equivalent of I'm doing God's work and I can cheat and do whatever? Explain to me how that mentality goes, because the idea of God's work is maybe I'm not making much money helping the poor, but I'm doing something of a higher calling. So how does that translate into the leftist mentality?
Well, I think that the conventional definition of doing God's work is doing things that are truthful, and that are doing things that are trying to get to truths and trying to find the good and then trying to act on that. Their idea of God's work is to do whatever needs to be done to obtain power. It's not and that means lying. In fact, lying is, if you're lying in the name of the greater cause, then that's virtuous. They believe that they are doing something virtuous because they believe that Trump is evil. And I think that, your average, these young women who are committing stuffing the ballot box on the video, I think that they have genuinely been convinced that Trump is evil. I mean, they and I can understand why, when you have the media day after day, week after week, year after year, with nothing but this constant hateful drumbeat, then a person that doesn't have a strong inner core or a basic set of beliefs, they could be swept into that.
All right.
But the people who are the conspirators, the people who are conscious, they don't think that Trump is evil. They just think they want to stop Trump because his agenda is dangerous to leftism. is standing up for national sovereignty, and he's returning power to the citizen, and he's putting America first. And they would tolerate that from kind of a middle of the road Republican, maybe like one of the Bushes. But with Trump, he means it, and he's actually doing this. And so they are determined to do whatever is necessary to destroy him, because he is dismantling the entire edifice that they've been putting up, as you say, since Woodrow Wilson.
And how many people, though, convert? Because you're talking to these people all the time.
I think that they get them when they're young. They get them in now the schools. I mean, look at Karl Marx talked about this as one of the planks of the Communist Manifesto, that you have to get the children to be taught properly and to be, quote, educated, unquote. So they've infiltrated the schools. They certainly have the grip on the public schools and even most of the private schools, I think.
But in your experience, which is fairly vast, how many of these true believers convert back
to conservatism? Very few. I think that once you immerse yourself in it, you're invested in it. It's like,
okay.
And maybe there's a part of it that's simple human nature. If you're involved with something, you almost suspend elements of your own consciousness. You become like, you basically subsume a good portion of your identity, and you no longer are conscious of what you're doing. I mean, Harry Dexter White, who was spying for the Soviet Union, if you read Whittaker Chambers' book, because Whittaker Chambers handled him, and that's a great book, by the way. He says that White said, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. It's almost like I'm walking as a shadow. I mean, he became, on the one hand, he was this eminent economist who was crafting, the Bretton Woods Convention. On the other hand, he was giving Stalin secrets. And it was like he was in such denial that he wasn't even, it was almost like there were two people in the same body. And I think that there is kind of a shattering of the inner core, that people can go through their life like that. And the longer they go, the more invested they are in it, to the point where you reach a point where to take a look within and reevaluate would mean having to disavow much of your entire life. And most people don't have the strength or the character to do that, or to even go through any process like that. And I understand that it is difficult to do. And, I mean, we all, as part of the human condition, we're all sort of trying to debug ourselves from falseness and from mistaken ideas that we've had at different times in our lives. But when you get so immersed in this particular ideology, it just becomes much more difficult, because I think it's almost ironed into you, and they lose their identity.
Well,
Plus, there are all the awards that you get from that. I mean, you get advancement, you get awards. I mean, you take a look at these people, the way they're worshipped, and you become the bright, sunny, warm glow of acceptance. And I mean, it's very alluring. It's intoxicating. People don't want to give that up. Why would you?
Worse than being part of a cult?
It is. You are, in the broad sense, a part of a cult, and it is similar. If you join a cult, come on in. Welcome to the club. They give you dinners and they take care of you, and you suddenly have this nice feeling that people like you, and you don't have to do anything to get them to like you. All you have to do is just be there and say a few nice things. And you suddenly feel like you're important. They boost you up. They build up your miserable, ego, right? And then all of a sudden, oh, well, I mean, and this, in a sense, in the broad sense, is similar to a cult. I mean, I don't think it's a cult in that you've got, Jimmy Jones from the Jamestown, telling you to drink the Kool-Aid, but it's a mentality that's cult-like.
But people leave cults. And people can be deprogrammed from cults.
Well, people are. We look at David Horowitz, grew up in communism, and he, in the 1960s, he was the editor of Ramparts. He was a real left radical, red
Red
guy. Yeah, and he was Yeah, you bet. And he was friendly with the big ones, Tom Hayden, and he hung out with the, that whole crowd and the Black Panthers. Something happened that made him change his mind. I mean, I think a very close associate of his was murdered by the.
Well, yeah. What that story was,
Yeah.
I believe her name was Betty Van Patter.
Yeah.
Was a white. People can check the details, but I believe this is correct. David told me himself. Was a secretary for one of the Panther offices, and someone accused her. It turns out unjustly, of ratting something to the local cops of the Oakland police, and she was whacked.
Yeah.
And then that was, I think, the defining moment that changed Horowitz's whole perspective.
Yeah, and I think that the thing that was particularly disturbing about it was that she went down as a true leftist. I mean, she didn't have any, she had no idea what had happened to her. She never really woke up from it. She just,
Thank you for shooting me, Comrade Stalin. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, there were people that were held in the gulag who, was saying, please tell Comrade Stalin, I'm here. I still love him. I mean, this is a radical. I mean, Whitaker Chambers talks about this. He said that you cannot, to fight a communist, you're talking about somebody who is willing to go out and be shot 100 times in the name of the fight against, what they see as the enemy. I mean, these are extremely, zealous and very devout people.
Well, look at Ethel Rosenberg. Ethel Rosenberg was given the chance to save herself by just admitting that she was involved in this thing, and she didn't do it, making her kids orphans.
I've seen it.
Look how the kids turned out, though. That's even more.
Well, yeah, they're quite radical.
Yeah,
and they've written books. I mean, I try to have one of them on, but the show they won't come on. But they're just they've completely imbibed the intoxicating waters. Yeah. And I mean, they're willing to look. They this is like the mentality of the suicide bomber, right?
Yeah,
they're on a mission. It becomes, you remove the individual identity, you remove God, you remove basic notions of what is true and reality, and you have the makings of a true believer, and that's whom they exploit. That's who the Nazis exploited when they used to go. I mean, don't forget the Nazi movement really started on college campuses. It was young people, impressionable people. I mean, this is what Marx noted. I mean, it's going to have to start with the young people. We're going to recruit students who are not yet formed. I mean, they don't have an intellectual ability to develop a strong center yet. They don't have those kinds of skills. And we bring them in, we offer them, they get a nice girlfriend, all of a sudden, you're a hot shot, people get sucked into it. It's like, it's ultimately the siren song of Satan. I'm sorry to put it that way, but it's earthly pleasure. We're going to give you all of the wonders. This is like the cult of the assassins in Iran, which is where the word assassination comes from. It was a radical Islamic Shiite cult. It was actually headed up by this guy, I think al-Sabri, I believe, who had these magnificent palace up in the mountains. And, they'd go to like some local poor community and they'd pick up some young kid who had nothing and who was poor. And they'd say, we're going to offer you paradise if you go along with us. They then bring them to the castle. They have women and wine and everything you can imagine. And they live this incredible life for about 5 weeks. And then they send them out on a mission to assassinate someone. And they say that if you do this assassination, I wrote an article about this right after 9/11. I did some research on it. Then the act of killing that person is a religious act because their energy, their earthly energy, their soul will go into you and you're going to become super strong. And it's kind of a conditioning. It's like, and then you will inherit this wonderful paradise forever. And I think that there's a version of that. That's also where the word hashish comes from. hashishim. They would get stoned. You know, they would use a lot of drugs, and people would be in an altered state of consciousness, right? And I think that that's part of it. Even then, even now, you know, you develop this kind of super consciousness from where you're manipulated, and I think there's an element of that in the recruitment of particularly younger people. Whereas the older people, either they are completely hardened or they do know better, and they're just, you know, they're playing the game. I mean, they're in it because.
All right, where would you have put, because you interviewed him, where would you have put Zinn?
Zinn was a hardcore communist, in my opinion. A nasty. He had all of the affectations too. I mean, the facial tics and the sneers and the mannerisms. You know, people pick up certain memes that reflect the leader of the group at some point. I mean, this is the theory. Who was it, the Harvard professor who developed the concept of the memes? Was it like Hoskins or someone? Hawkins, I believe.
Okay.
He wrote a book about it in the 1970s. And he said that, you know, society picks up certain memes, certain like sounds, certain visual images, certain habits, and these things get passed on, and eventually it's inculcated into different societies in different ways based upon their experience. And that when you have a leader of a group that's very powerful, their behaviors, their actions, the way they carry themselves can be imitated to the point where it carries on. And in that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, for example, George Washington knew when he became president of the United States that he was very careful with his public image and how he appeared, because he knew that he would set a tone in this country. Yeah, and also that every president since then has kind of, in a certain, even unconscious way, followed his approach. You know, he took care of how he would enter a room, how he was addressed, how he would sit on his horse, you know, how his hair was combed, you know, the kind of suit that he wore. I mean, he was very meticulous about all elements of his public image. And I think that the same thing could be said about Karl Marx. And Howard Zinn, I think, personified Marx. And I think you find that in leftists. Angry, righteous, enraged, you know, feeling like they have some superior knowledge. You know, Marx, every morning when he woke up, he was like he was descending from Mount Sinai, you know, to share with the world all, you know, there's a certain, I mean, people, I'm not trying to stereotype here, but I've noticed over the years, and I've interviewed probably at least hundreds, if not up to 1,000 leftists. And plus I know them in my own life. I was a leftist. I mean, I've known, you know, relatives who were in the Communist Party. I mean, they're a certain way of communicating, a certain syrupy quality, you know, a righteous kind of like thing. And there's certain noises and certain facial expressions. I mean, that they embrace. Now, they're not unique in that regard. I mean, I think that, Christianity might be based upon certain of the mannerisms of Jesus Christ, right? We don't know that. It could be. I think Islam imitates Muhammad, even to the point where they wear some of the clothes that they think he wore.
Well, what was your conversion story? First of all, how old were you before you left the dark side?
Well, it was a gradual thing, but I think that there were a couple of pivotal moments which sort of really woke me up. And one of them was listening to talk radio in the 1980s, particularly Jerry Williams, who was, by the way, a liberal. I mean, he was not conservative, but there was something about him that came through for me on the air. I mean, it was an honesty that cut through some of the BS that I had always been exposed to and I had always imbibed. And then the other thing that happened was, I can actually point to it, 1986, I filled out my first tax return as an independent businessman. It was my first year in business. I had a modest success. I went to H&R Block to file my taxes. I was proud to do it. I felt like this is a great country. This has given so much to me. I'm happy to pay taxes. And I really didn't understand, you know, taxes at the time. in all fairness.
Right.
But I filled out with the tax accountant there. She helped me fill out the form, and I looked at the figure that I'd owe, and I'm like, okay, that's a good amount of money, but I can do it. And she goes, no, we're not done yet. And then we had to do Social Security and FICA and state taxes and this and that and the other thing. And before you know it, the amount had doubled. And I was so upset that I almost was speechless. I was almost catatonic. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to have to take everything that I earned and more to get to this amount. And there was all these things I wanted to do this year I was going to hire people. I was going to expand. None of that's going to happen now because all of it's going to taxes. And that was an awakening for me, because then I began to think about, between that and listening to Jerry on the air, who is getting this money and what are they doing with it? I mean, I understand the government needs money to function, and I'm happy to pay it. I want to have an army. I want policemen. I want teachers. I want to make sure the hungry are fed. I'm for that.
But you're unsure of $50 million to Pakistan for gender issues.
No, that's right. So that's exactly. I began to look at, this is really hurting me as a businessman. I could have invested this money into my business, which would have employed more people, which would have resulted in growth. Now I can't. Who's getting the money? And so that began my political research and exactly, what the government is doing. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing is that I became aware of the fact that I believed in God. And I always had believed in God, but it became more prominent to me. I really began to contemplate that and think about what that meant. And those factors all together led me toward leaving the left and becoming conservative.
Well, I mean, that's great, but then you don't have to, but an interesting discussion is your fellows over at the local, I don't know if you're Orthodox or conservative, Reform, whatever, but I'm sure a lot of those people are liberal.
Oh, yeah.
And profess a belief in God.
Well, I mean, my belief in God is separate from any particular, synagogue or organization. Right. I mean, I mean, most people, I would not resonate with most people that I know, but I mean, I did start to investigate Judaism, and I think because I never went to college in the organized sense, I've always taken courses, but I never actually went right into college. I've always been an independent learner and an independent thinker. And now looking back at that, even though, at the time I felt certain regrets for not having done that. And even now I still do, but I feel better about it only because I know that, I wasn't brainwashed.
That was a very tough atmosphere, especially when you would have gone in.
Yeah, it was not good. And
it was becoming, okay, I'm older than you, and I graduated some years before, but even in the 60s, I mean, obviously with the protest, but there were a lot of people that weren't in the protest, but it was starting to become the thing. And I would imagine that 15, 20 years later, it was very hard to avoid.
It was a very low point when I was to go to college, which was, I think, in the late 70s.
Yeah.
And I didn't see the utility in it.
Yeah.
And, but I think that because I continued my education and I continued reading voraciously and studying and taking courses here and there, I'm independent as a thinker, and that includes as a Jew, and it includes as a believer in God. I don't,
right.
I go to synagogue. I believe in the minyan. I believe in the scriptures, but I'm not like a synagogue man, I guess you might say. I'm not like part of a group. And I would say the same thing probably if I were Catholic or Protestant. I'm not like into the organization of it. I'm into the beliefs. I probably believe in more of the Judaic covenant than a lot of people who are Orthodox in that way. But my approach to it is more personal and spiritual than it is collective or group. I've never been a big group.
I find it interesting that most Orthodox Jews are conservative. But when you get into the other aspects, the Reform and so-called conservative, largely liberal. And
True.
somehow they can justify various positions, supposedly with their religious tradition. But then, I'm sure there's, in theory, Catholics shouldn't, but they do.
They do it. Yeah. I mean, they're all making it up as they go. It's just that simple. And particularly Reform Judaism. I mean, it's really something that it does more to itself. I mean, not completely, but from the covenant of the Torah. I mean, it just they decided, well, we're going to it's like they believe the Torah is a living document in the same way that the left believes that the Constitution is a living document.
Right.
They can make it up as they go. They can interpret it based upon what they want it to be. They can reshape it according to their personal whim, whatever that may be at any given time. And that's happened to a large portion of Judaism, and it's sad and it's wrong. I've written books about this. I've written books about what I believe happened to Judaism. It has to do with the emergence of a false Messiah in the 16th century that really corrupted a big portion of Judaism. And I don't think that the Jewish experience ever recovered from that fully. But I have hope. I think that, in fact, this election has brought hope because a very larger numbers of Jews voted for Donald Trump than I think any Republican since probably Eisenhower.
That was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what it was exactly.
And probably if you take away the cheat, it was probably more than that.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, because his daughter converted. And, he was so pro-Israel, even with the Jerusalem.
I think it's also just that Jews are beginning to question liberalism. I mean, they see that.
I hope so.
I mean, all those things about being pro-Israel, sure, but it's more fundamental than that. It's that I think that there is a movement within Judaism to embrace the faith and to that these leftist things have not worked. Now, that's the Jewish establishment, of course, is still hard left. The Anti-Defamation League. I mean, these people. Oh yeah, and
when did the ADL become so hard left? Because I remember for me, the early days, they were pretty much focused on legit attacks. They were against defamation, as it were.
Right.
Was their core business, and then they drifted into this left-wing activism without seemingly realizing that there were a whole lot of people on the left that hated Jews.
I personally think, and it's based on not a lot of deep research, but a little research, that they always were on the left. I mean, they've gone way out and more openly in recent years to the point where they now have, they don't say hardly anything about Judaism anymore. It's all about supporting abortion and gay marriage and any other left-wing fad that you can name. But I think they always were on the left. They made their bones, if you will, and they were a spin-off of B'nai B'rith, which is a Masonic or Jewish club. I mean, I don't want to go too into that, but that was in the late 19th century, I think it was established.
Was B'nai B'rith originally leftist?
Yes, I think it's always been left.
Okay.
But they didn't have the kind of influence, but now they spun off the ADL in response to the lynching of Jacob Frank in Atlanta. Now, just to give you a little background on that.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that case.
Yeah, this is the one case where a Jew was lynched in the South. And it was near Atlanta. He was, people don't realize this, but Jacob Frank was really a very despicable individual. He was a rapist. He was a murderer. He had been raping and abusing women. He was like a small level factory manager. They managed this pencil factory outside of Atlanta. The South had never been anti-Semitic. In fact, the South generally, I mean, much of this country was never anti-Semitic. There was always kind of a benign view of Jews. It was more
Wasn't
of
the
a,
treasurer of the Confederacy?
well, I was going to
Jewish?
say that the argument in this country was always between Protestants and Catholics.
Yeah.
And the Jews were kind of like seen as, nobody paid much attention.
Yeah.
And in the South, generally, Jews were admired. I mean, there was this classic example, and they were they're more reform, but you'd have like the Jewish store owner in the downtown of a city in the South or a town who, usually they were into like trade or manufacturing of something, whatever it is, textile, clothes stores. And the parents of the non-Jewish family would always say, go get a job with Weinstein. He's a good employer. And so the young man would go work for Weinstein. Weinstein would embrace him like a son. He'd work his way up. Then there'd be he'd have to duke it out with Weinstein's son,
Yeah.
to take over the company. And there was all this drama. But the point I'm making is that the Jew is generally respected. And even there are a lot of interesting stories about how if the Jew was not observant on Yom Kippur, the people in the community would be angry. They go, look, if you're going to be a Jew, we want you to behave like a Jew.
Yeah, that's right.
That's do what you're supposed to do. So there wasn't a history of anti-Semitism. And yes, Judah Benjamin, who was a Jew, and he was the second in command of the Confederacy. And Southerners were aware of that, and they admired him. And he was really the right-hand man to Jefferson Davis. And he was a true Confederate. So, there was no history of anti-Semitism at the time that Jacob Frank murdered Phelan, this young girl, who, and there was a witness to the murder, this black man who was a guard at the factory. And there was a trial. And all of a sudden, you had these liberal New York Jewish lawyers come down to Atlanta and take this on as a cause and start to stir up all kinds of crap.
That's a fascinating story. I didn't.
Yeah. Oh, this is anti-Semitic. And they played that card. They also played the race card. They called the black man who had witnessed the murder, oh, he's an N-word. Yeah. And he's, they used every trick they could. Well, it turned out that Jacob Frank was convicted of murder. He was in prison. And then you had this governor, I think his name was Patton, who was given some kind of job with the Jewish law firm, right? And he commuted the sentence of Jacob Frank. And there was a huge outrage over that boy. Because, but just before the commutation was to go into effect, he was kidnapped from the prison by a mob, and he was lynched. Now, I'm not saying that that's right, but you have to put the whole thing into context of what was going on with that. He was no great hero. I mean,
it wasn't exactly Joan of Arc.
No, I mean, he was a villain. I mean, he was convicted fairly by a trial. But the ACLU formed around that and said, this is anti-Semitism.
ADL.
I mean, the ADL. Not a big difference there either. But and they started to agitate this subject, and this is an example. And since then, most people don't really know the background of it, but it's kind of gone down in the lore. And people talk to me about it. They're shocked by what actually happened, that it was a terrible incident of anti-Semitism. This innocent Jewish man was lynched for being a Jew.
Oh, man.
Which, started this whole process. So I think that it's safe to say that the ADL has always been liberal. They have always taken on liberal causes. I'm not saying they're all bad. I mean, they have chronicled anti-Semitism. It's real. I certainly know that. But they are very much imbued onto the left and into the left establishment.
Put up a front too.
Yeah, no, I think that they do. I mean, I think that they're not all, like anything else. I mean, there's good and bad, but they're not good Jews. I mean, let's put it that way. They're not believers in God. You don't find too many people in the ADL who actually, are Torah true. You don't find them to be all that concerned with things like, kosher laws or anything like that. They're very secular, and they're very left, and that spawned the Jewish establishment, the Jewish Federation, as they call it. And they're all very liberal. But, look, I don't think they reflect, I wouldn't say, they probably do reflect most Jews in America, I should say. Let me be more precise. But they don't reflect all. And there's a growing movement against them. And there's always been opposition. But they control the high ground. They're the ones who give the grants. They're the ones who, give the recommendations for placement and for advancement. And, they have their tentacles in the colleges and, and everywhere else. So, they've got power in the Jewish community.
The analogy on the Catholic side is Theodore Hesburgh.
From Notre Dame. That's a good example.
Who the cliche that I didn't make up, but it is funny, that applied to him. He was always on TV, and I wish I knew who said it, but it was one of the conservative Catholic groups, that Hesburgh proved that the only good Catholic is a bad Catholic. And this is why his brand of liberal, quasi-secular Catholicism was embraced. Everything he did was wrong, just about. But that was at least on the media side, after Fulton Sheen died, who was legit conservative.
Right, he was great man. I've watched some of his videos. It's tremendous.
That Hesburgh took this up, and there's a lot of the so-called mainstream Catholics who are liberal. I would argue that they're probably atheists, but just wrap themselves in that mantle. So there's some similarities.
Oh yeah, I mean, look at Nancy Pelosi, right?
Oh, yeah,
she wraps herself in the Catholic flag. I mean, Joe Biden, right? I mean, these people, the Kennedys, not John F. as much as maybe Teddy. The Cuomos, right? They're liberal Catholics, and they wrap themselves in the flag. I mean, it is very similar. And I think that it was Hesburgh he was supported by the WASP Protestant establishment, the people like, that ran Time magazine, who put him on the cover a lot, and Luce, Henry Luce, and all of those people. And there was also this other guy that he was a priest, and his name escapes me right now. I interviewed
Dryden?
No. I'm talking about, he was held up as this national icon.
He was from Chicago. I forget his name.
Yeah, you know who I mean. Very handsome. He was on the cover of Time magazine a lot.
He was terrible. God, I can't think of his name.
I know. And I actually interviewed an author of a book about this whole story. I should have him back. But, these were the guys that were promoted by the establishment. Yeah. Mainly by the Protestant establishment, I may add, and that they were there to Americanize the Catholic Church. And, to a certain extent, they've been successful. Father Dryden was an interesting character, though. You're right to mention him. He actually brought the first article of impeachment against Nixon as a congressman. He was my congressman here in Boston. I remember him. Actually, he was quite a firebrand. I mean, when Israel, during the Yom Kippur War of 1973, there was a rally in front of on the steps of a synagogue in Brooklyn, a big, very prominent synagogue, and he spoke at that rally, and he was great. I mean, he was more pro-Israel than the rabbi. I mean, he was getting up a fiery speech, and he just, I remember that. I was there. I went with my father, and it was like, wow. I mean, too bad our rabbi, whatever he's having for breakfast, he should tell the rabbi. I mean, he was just amazing. And I think what happened to Dryden, and he was also, he kind of would wiggle out of issues like abortion because he was a priest, but yet he was elected to Congress, and the Pope wanted him to step down as congressman or leave the priesthood.
That's right.
And he was a professor at Boston College, also a really brilliant guy. I think he was a lawyer. And for years, he would dodge the messenger from the Pope. Literally. I mean, he would Father so-and-so is coming. He'd leave, he'd go to another town. I mean, because he he didn't want to be served this letter, because I guess they had to hand it to him in person.
Right.
That would ask. And finally, he got the letter, and he did step down. And then, of course, we had Barney Frank.
Oh, it's the same district. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the story of Father Robert Drine, an interesting man, very liberal.
The guy, I'll have to look it up afterwards, or maybe one of the viewers can post it in the YouTube comments. He wrote books. He was from Chicago.
Yeah.
I just can't.
We cannot remember him, but he was huge, and he was promoted and held up as a great American Catholic because he was acceptable to the liberal establishment. Right. Exactly. Look at, I mean, they did the same thing in the Black community too, right? I mean, the more liberal ministers would be held up as representing the community, and the more conservatives were shut down. I interviewed this Reverend Jackson, who said he didn't like Martin Luther King, and I don't want to go into that topic, but he was like, King was promoted because he kowtowed to the left, whereas the real church was shunted aside. So you had that phenomena in all religions. In a way, it's how the left infiltrated religion in this country and in the world.
Well, they marched through the institutions, and that was one of them.
And in the Protestant side, you had the National Council of Churches, and there was testimony in Congress that they were outright communist infiltrated. Yeah. Yeah. Who was it? The red minister, what do they call it? Ward, I think his name was. It was outright communist. It was a communist front. And it was the main coordinator of mainline Protestant churches. So, they didn't leave faith alone. I mean, they infiltrated all elements of our public life. They infiltrated business. They infiltrated academia, culture, and religion. Anywhere with this power.
Well, power is their equivalent of God, I guess.
It is.
Do you think that the way to stop this, because it seems almost insurmountable, that we're creating new leftists with every kid that walks onto a college campus?
Yes.
How about some sort of deprogramming movement? This was a big deal a number of years ago with Scientology.
With Scientology, yeah. I remember I interviewed, who was it? Emerson, I think his name was, who was very involved in that. I think he had been in Scientology. And he came out and he was deprogramming.
There were a few highly prominent former Scientologists.
Exactly. In fact, I think I saw a part of a special about this, and they're helping people come out. I mean, not that this is a cult, but I interviewed this elderly couple years ago who were involved with, I think it was Seventh-day Adventism. Yeah. I'm not sure. I believe it was. And they said that was cult-like, and they said there was child abuse and there was major problems. And when they left the church, their son said, that he'll never be able to speak to them again, and they'll never see their grandchildren again if they leave the church. And they didn't. They did leave the church, and they never spoke to their family. They lost their family. And they said that they didn't blame the son because that's what the religion teaches. He was in it. And that's how it goes. I mean, they understood it. But they came on my show. It was a pretty popular show. I should have them back. But they talked about how cult-like that was. So, it kind of transcends, the left. These are highly, organizations that use various tactics of mind control and at different levels. And, they kind of, one of the typical elements of it is they tell you to cut ties with anybody that disagrees and join them.
Well, and that's certainly Scientology.
Oh, yeah. To disavow your parents, disavow anyone, friends, family, anybody that's outside. And you're taken into this like cocoon-like atmosphere. I suppose you might even say it works like a casino, right? If anybody who knows how gambling works, when you go to a casino, there are no windows. There's There's all these noises and clinking and clanking and sounds. There's no clocks, no watches. No, you lose your, it's designed by psychologists to help you lose your balance and to lose your sense of time. Everything becomes, it's like you're suspended in time. and it creates an atmosphere by which you're more amicable to gambling. You just get wrapped up in it. And I think that's how cults work. It's very
okay, but here's a thought experiment. What if some wealthy individual on our side decided to create a squad, for the lack of a better name, of deprogrammers that would take on these leftist, highly respected individuals who, as you would agree, I think, many of whom have big egos. So they're not going to be able to dodge these confrontations forever.
Well, the question is, how do you confront them in such a way that, maybe people who are following them, you could maybe peel them off and or a few of them, or you might end up triggering a glimmer of consciousness. I've been through this with people. I've tried to deprogram people over the years.
Well, what would have happened? The circumstances wouldn't have quite worked this way. But what would have happened if you were able to engage Zinn in a situation where his prestige was on the line and he really had to defend some of these positions?
Zinn would not do that. He would not allow that to happen. I mean, he would start yelling. He would start, his feathers would go up. He'd become like a gold pheasant.
Isn't even that bad enough that your hero, Professor Zinn, is now reduced to being this raving lunatic?
You'd think so, but I don't think that. I think that the people around him will become just as incensed. It becomes, there's the mob mentality element. Anybody knows that. I mean, right now I'm writing, thanks to you, Mike, I'm writing a book about Satan.
Did you interview him?
Well, I'm finally at the point where I am, right? I mean, my first chapter sort of sets the stage by talking about God again, but I am starting to think about Satan, and that the satanic influence takes on a magnifying element when you have a mob, because when you're involved with two or more people, maybe three or more people, by nature, you're willing to suspend a certain level of consciousness in order to get along with everyone and in order to flow with the situation,
Sure.
Right? That's just natural. But when you join something where there are rewards, it becomes, you become a part of it, and you forget that you've given up elements of your thinking, and you're sucked into it. And, it's always bad. This is why the founding generation of the United States were against democracy. They wanted a republic. They wanted limited government.
Yeah.
John Adams talked about a government of laws and not of men. That we would have an objective set of laws that were derived from reality, that were derived from actually Sinai, in my opinion, that would not be manipulated by the whims of the mob. They would respect the most vulnerable of minorities, which is the individual and the family, that they would not be majority rule. They would not, the left always wants majority rule because they know that a mob subsumes conventional notions of morality and of what's right and wrong, and they get wrapped up in the emotion. They become wrapped up in the sensate. It becomes like a feeling experience. Now, I'm not saying religion doesn't do a little of this too, but there's a level of it where they can be manipulated by bad ideas. So when you have a guy like Zinn, people are hypnotized. His book, The People's History of the United States, did such damage to people. It was so poisonous. And yet it had such a mass appeal because he promised to, it was exciting to poke the hornet's nest, shove a stick in the establishment to give it to the man. And he exploited that in a way that was not good. I mean, I think it is good to poke the man once in a while, but not to tear someone down, not to destroy what is good. So
yeah, it was very depressing when I discovered how widespread that book was.
Oh, it's hugely, and still is. It's still it's almost required reading now in high schools.
It just blows my mind that they were able to convince all these school districts.
Oh yeah, and it is a malevolent view of America. It is a malevolent view of manhood. It's a malevolent view of property. It's a malevolent view of of capitalism for sure. The most conventional elements of
But
life.
it is funny though that he made a lot of money
Oh yeah, well
being a
sure.
hardcore communist on that book.
Well, that's typical, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's something that the left. If you ask, I've asked people about that. Even some people I know about that. I mean, if you believe in communism, whatever happened to from each according to his ability to each according to his need, I don't see anybody saying you can't redistribute your wealth. Why not give it? The guy down the street doesn't have as much as you. Why not let, and the answer is always, well, I have worked hard in the cause of socialism, and this is my reward. I'm entitled to it.
Well, of course, that's completely self-contradictory.
Well, yeah, think of the irony of that. Whereas if I was just doing it to make money, like the corporate, then that's stealing. But for me, I'm entitled to this good life. I mean, that's why you have communist dictators are so, they live so lavishly, they'd make any rich American blush. I mean, Fidel Castro, Yasser Arafat, Ho Chi Minh, these people, Mao, they were living like absolute kings. I mean, more so than you'd imagine. But technically, they didn't own anything, you see.
Yeah.
It's all, confiscated from others, and that the state is providing this for their wonderful service in the advancement of socialism, which is taking it away from everyone else.
Well, you would think that is a good enough argument, but I don't know. It would seem that something should be done to stop the insanity. Because by the time you get into the political arena and have somebody like Warnock running in Georgia.
Oh, terrible.
Yeah, then it's almost too late. And it's like,
yeah.
How the hell did that guy get to that point anyway?
It's unbelievable how bad this country's sunk. I mean, this is he's like Jeremiah Wright.
Yeah.
Hates America, anti-Semite for sure.
Oh.
Abusing children at a summer camp. I mean, just the record is just a miserable.
Abusing his wife, ex-wife.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, didn't he run over her foot or something? I mean,
yeah. I mean, it's so.
Yeah, horrible.
You'd think it's easy enough to attack these people, but somehow, I think maybe you said it earlier, that you could make Zinn look like an idiot.
It doesn't matter.
He'd still be defended because you know what? That was your fault. That.
Right.
You provoked this old man and you shouldn't have done that.
And somehow it's okay because he's on the right side of history.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
He's embraced the good cause. It doesn't matter. We will look the other way at who he is. It's all, for the better, for the good. He's a tool for the state. As long as he genuflects to the left, he's fine. I mean, that's how the Clintons got away with it all those years. As long as they genuflected a little to the left, as long as they served as good tools, they could enrich themselves. They could commit everything short of murder. Some even say maybe not so short.
Yeah, Arkansas. Right.
Yeah. I mean, just not to go to a subject.
Right.
But, they could do this because they were good, solid, players on the left. They were good. They were useful. They were tools. They knew how to do this. I mean, Obama's not that far off from that, actually, not to get into a subject.
No, but I think that you have to stop this before it gets to that point. And
well, we have been able to in this country, and it worries me that now we have a situation where we might be at a tipping point. Now I see younger people who, they're gone. I mean, they're so embedded in it, and there's something hard and bitter when I see them now.
Oh yeah.
It's like there's something soulless, and it's these are people that I know. I mean, and I love. And it's like it's really.
I think it came out of the school system, but at some point, and I don't know how you nurture this. I really don't, but it's worth thinking about. Maybe on the next show, how do you reach these people? Because at some point, I mean, maybe people aren't like this. Maybe people, when they go to these college classes, they don't question things.
Right.
They're so interested. Yeah, I'm going to regurgitate this on the exam, but they didn't have the thing. You know what? I'll just do this to get the grade. But really, what a crop.
Well, I think that they embrace it. You know,
Yeah.
they start to travel in those vineyards. I mean, they give up at some point their own mind. This is a big subject, Mike, and I think that it's something we ought to discuss at length.
Yeah.
I am,
How you make these
how do
converts.
we reach people?
Yeah, I mean,
How do we get people out of this? You know, how
well,
do
I
we
mean, the
bring people
preamble,
back?
I think we agree, is that, okay, fine, we all have all this election crap and so on, but we've got to stop it before it gets to that point.
Yeah, I mean, we're now at the point where everyone in this country, whether they admit it or not, knows that the election is being stolen. Everyone knows it.
Yeah.
And that's in spite of the complete media blackout. The thing that's shocking to me is how many people either don't care or they actually agree with it. They want it to be stolen because they hate Trump. They've been so imbibed with this that, you know, they were willing to go through this. And I'm including people that I respect who believe this. And the fact that we're at that point in this country is really a tipping point, I think, and it's very, very disturbing, especially now with this kind of, we should talk about this subject, the so-called reset. I don't know if you're up on this.
Oh, yeah.
You know, this is.
Yeah, Vigano was one of the first people to mention that word.
Yes, great man. And I interviewed Jay Dyer, who is an expert on this on the show, and he's got a lot of information. I'm just getting up to speed. It's going to be the big subject for next year, certainly, regardless of whether Trump is president. Even if he is president, it's still good. This is the big one. This is the very ideological core of the future. This is like, you know, the Renaissance. This is an influence similar to what Isaac Newton had, or, you know, some of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment. This is the new way of thinking. We're going to have to dig into it. We're going to have to examine it. And I think that along with how to save young people from leftism, those are probably going to be my two main themes for this next year.
I think that's great.
Yeah. And we both, I think that you're in a position where you have a lot to say about it. And, you know, if we put our heads together and grow this program, we might have some influence. Who knows?
You know, from your lips to God's ears.
Yeah, right.
And,
so listen, Mike, I wish you a good new year. Happy New Year.
And same to you.
To you and yours.
And look, I think 2021 has to be better.
I
think we've seen the abyss.
Yeah, and it ain't going to go away anytime soon, but it does have to get better. Absolutely. So I'll talk to you next week.
Sounds good to